the idea of capacity, our biology, evolution. You've talked about it defining essentially our capacity, our limit, and our scope. Can you try to define what limit and scope are? And the bigger question, do you think it's possible to find the limit of human cognition?
Well, that's an interesting question. It's commonly believed, most scientists believe, that a human intelligence can answer any question in principle. I think that's a very strange belief. If we were biological organisms, which are not angels, then our capacities ought to have scope and limits, which are interrelated.
Can you define those two terms?
Well, let's take a concrete example. Your genetic endowment determines that you can have a mammalian visual system, arms and legs and so on, and therefore become a rich, complex organism. But if you look at that same genetic endowment, it prevents you from developing in other directions. There's no kind of experience which would yield the embryo to develop an insect visual system or to develop wings instead of arms. So the very endowment that confers richness and complexity also sets bounds on what can be attained. Now, I assume that our cognitive capacities are part of the organic world. Therefore, they should have the same properties. If they had no built-in capacity to develop a rich and complex structure, we would understand nothing. Just as if your genetic endowment did not compel you to develop arms and legs, you would just be some kind of a random amoeboid creature with no structure at all. So I think it's plausible to assume that there are limits, and I think we even have some evidence as to what they are. So, for example, there's a classic moment in the history of science at the time of Newton. There was from Galileo to Newton, modern science developed on a fundamental assumption, which Newton also accepted, namely that the world the entire universe is a mechanical object. And by mechanical, they meant something like the kinds of artifacts that were being developed by skilled artisans all over Europe, gears, levers, and so on. And their belief was, well, the world is just a more complex variant of this. Newton, to his astonishment and distress, proved that there are no machines, that there's interaction without contact. His contemporaries like Leibniz and Huygens just dismissed this as returning to the mysticism of the neo-scholastics. And Newton agreed. He said it is totally absurd. No person of any scientific intelligence could ever accept this for a moment. In fact, he spent the rest of his life trying to get around it somehow, as did many other scientists. That was the very criterion of intelligibility for, say, Galileo or Newton. Theory did not produce an intelligible world unless you could duplicate it in a machine. He showed you can't. There are no machines, any. Finally, after a long struggle, it took a long time, scientists just accepted this as common sense. But that's a significant moment. That means they abandoned the search for an intelligible world. And the great philosophers of the time understood that very well. So, for example, David Hume, in his encomium to Newton, wrote that, who was the greatest thinker ever, and so on. He said that he unveiled many of the secrets of nature, but by showing the imperfections of the mechanical philosophy, mechanical science, he showed that there are mysteries which ever will remain. And science just changed its goals. It abandoned the mystery, said, can't solve it, we'll put it aside. We only look for intelligible theories. And Newton's theories were intelligible. It's just what they described wasn't. Well, Locke said the same thing. I think they're basically right. And if so, that showed something about the limits of human cognition. We cannot attain the goal of understanding the world, of finding an intelligible world. This mechanical philosophy, Galileo to Newton, there's a good case that can be made that that's our instinctive conception of how things work. So if, say, infants are tested with things that if this moves and then this moves, they kind of invent something that must be invisible that's in between them that's making them move and so on.
Yeah, we like physical contact. Something about our brain seeks.
Makes us want a world like that, just like it wants a world that has regular geometric figures. So, for example, Descartes pointed this out, that if you have an infant who's never seen a triangle before, and you draw a triangle, the infant will see a distorted triangle, not whatever crazy figure it actually is, 3 lines not coming quite together, or one of them a little bit curved, and so on. We just impose a conception of the world in terms of perfect geometric objects. It's now been shown that it goes way beyond that if you show on a tachistoscope, let's say, a couple of lights shining, you do it 3 or 4 times in a row, what people actually see is a rigid object in motion, not whatever's there. We all know that from a television set, basically.
So that gives us hints of potential limits to our cognition.
I think it does, but it's a very contested view. If you do a poll among scientists, it's impossible. We can understand anything.